Part 15. Attack Run. Reseda Galleria, 5:06 p.m. John pushed through the crowded video arcade. It was a riot of cheap electronic sound effects and glowing monitors depicting mass destruction in video miniature. Tim peeled off by an Aliens game where he saw two of his friends. John nodded to a few familiar faces from school, then angled in behind a teenager he didn't know, getting all his Desert War F-14s wasted by missiles. John studied the attack patterns. He was good at that. When the last aircraft exploded in a shower of digitized debris and "Game Over" flashed on the screen, John took over the controls and dropped in a token. He pulled back on the stick and the ground rapidly fell away. John's brow furrowed and his whole being focused in on the screen. The first missile caught him by surprise, but he reacted instantly, evading it by diving low. Then another arced out. John fired his wing cannon and vaporized it. This game was easy. In the parking garage, the Terminator's idling Harley rumbled as he stopped at a row of bikes near the escalators. John's little Honda sat proudly with the big street bikes. The Terminator parked his cycle and shut off the engine. Officer Austin moved through the flow of people. The place was clogged with Saturday shoppers of all ages. The cop looked from one young male face to the next, anxiously seeking the familiar one. He approached a few kids near Perry's Pizza on the second floor and showed them the photograph. They could only shrug. He glanced over at a security guard who was eyeing him curiously. Austin considered the possible alternatives, and a second later walked up to the man and showed him the photo, asking him to look out for the boy. In the arcade, John was now lost in an intense battle, going for a new high score at Missile Command. He deftly parried as the enemy's ICBMs deployed their MIRVs. The warheads streamed down. 3, 4, no 5 at once. John flicked the controls as rapidly as he could, but it was more than he could deal with. The world erupted in a white-hot mushroom cloud. Game over. His score appeared. It was in the upper third percentile range, but he had lost the war. Bored, he slouched away from the game, looking for another. Outside the window, Officer Austin passed. His eyes rested on the spot where John had occupied, just as he left it and blended into the crowd. The cop moved on, down the concourse, out of sight. John stopped by an afterburner simulator game, checked his pocket of tokens, plenty more. He slipped into the cockpit. The Terminator strode through the shoppers, like Paul Bunyan through the forest, incredibly carrying a box of long-stem roses, like some hopeful guy with a hot date. He moved with methodical purpose, knowing his target was close. Face after face was rapid scanned. No internal bells were sounded. Sooner rather than later. Austin had reached the end of the walkway. He had given a cursory check of the stores on all the floors. No John Connor. He turned to reassess his path, glancing at the storefronts. Hot dog stand, shoe store, gift shop, pizza parlor, taco stand, bookstore, video arcade, seafood restaurant. Austin turned back to the video arcade. A dozen kids posed outside the entrance, each vainly trying to impress the other. More were going in and out all the time. Austin decided to start with a more detailed search of the arcade. He walked into the maze of chattering, bustling youths. Across the room, John was shooting down MiGs at Mach 2. Tim slid up next to him, tapping him on the shoulder, trying to play it cool, but only partly succeeding. There was controlled panic in his voice. "Some cop is scoping for you, dude." "Right. John said, shrugging him off. Really, man, look. John knew this was bullshit, but glanced around the corner of the afterburner ride anyway. A tall, lean, uniformed cop was showing a picture to a group of kids nearby. They were gaping at it, frowning. One of them pointed his way. Adrenaline kick-started John's heart, and he ducked just as the cop glanced over. John scrambled out of the other side and headed for the back of the arcade, instinctively retreating. One early lesson his mother had taught him was that cops were bad news. Austin approached the ride and caught a glimpse of John moving down a row of arcade machines. Austin lunged after. John glanced over his shoulder and saw his worst fears take shape as the cop began pushing through the crowd. The boy increased his pace, darting around a short, fat teenager. The cop was closing in, slamming the fat kid to the floor. An eddy of outrage began to build behind him as he started running right for John. John needed no more incentive. He broke into a dead run. So did the cop. Kids scattered like 10-pins as Austin charged through them. John sprinted through the arcade's back office and storerooms, dodging the assistant manager, and burst out a fire door into the service corridor. The long, underlit tunnel led directly to the parking garage. And escape. If only he could make it. Heart hammering, John burst into a flat-out dash for the far door. He was halfway there when the Terminator stepped into view. In an instant, John recognized the face. He had seen it many times in the newspaper clippings his mother had shown him as he was growing up. It was that guy. The crazy dude who shot up that police station. The one his mother had thought was a Terminator. He was standing here, now, plain as the nose on his face. John desperately tried to brake to a stop before he collided with the stranger. The target was acquired. The cold black steel of his shotgun emerged as the box fell open, the roses spilling to the floor. The Terminator's boot crushed the flowers as it moved forward, raising the gauge's barrel. John, transfixed by terror, was trapped in the narrow, featureless shooting gallery of the corridor. A protoplasmic version of a video target. For an instant, time seemed to grind to a halt, and in his hyped state, the boy realized that the crazy dude was going to try to kill him. The Terminator expressionlessly jacked around into the chamber, moving slowly and fluidly, as if he'd done it 1,000,000 times. The kerchack was thunderous in the corridor. Time began to rev back up to speed as John skidded to a stop and whirled to run the other way. But the cop was sprinting towards him in a fast, assured lope, pulling his Beretta pistol as he came and aiming right at him. John looked back at the stranger. He was staring into the black muzzle of the gauge, leveled at his head. John had never felt so desolate in his life. The cold, bloody visions of mindless violence that had plagued his nights for years were now becoming real, with him in the center. John couldn't do one thing about it. Then, something crazy happened. The man with the shotgun suddenly said, "Get down," in a bland, casual voice. John liked the sound of that so much he obeyed instantly, throwing himself to the floor. The shotgun blast over his head nearly deafened him. John looked back to see the cop catch the shell square in the chest just as he fired his pistol. His bullet ricocheted harmlessly off the ceiling. Before he could re-aim, the stranger pumped another round into him, then another. Advancing a step each time, he fired. He emptied the shotgun into the cop, blowing him backwards down the corridor, the shock of each hit making the man's body buck. John saw no blood, just flashes of chrome as each shell struck the cop. The sound of each explosion ran together into a harsh, ringing echo. Then hollow silence. John sat up, eyes wide, not breathing, just gaping at the dead man at the other end of the hall. The cop was on his back, unmoving. A shadow fell across John, and he looked up at the stranger looming right over him. But he wasn't looking at John. He was watching the far end of the corridor. John turned back. The cop slowly sat up. John frowned, thinking he was back in the nightmare. The officer rose to his feet, as if he just tripped instead of being shot with 5 10-gauge rounds. It didn't make any sense to John. It did to the Terminator. He grabbed John roughly by his jacket and clutched the kid to his chest, then spun around as the cop opened fire with the Beretta. He coolly pulled the trigger so fast it almost seemed like a machine pistol. The 9mm slug slammed into the Terminator's back, punching bloody holes in the motorcycle jacket. A startled man emerged from a restroom and stepped right into the line of fire. He was instantly cut down by the fusillade. Then the Beretta clacked on empty. John looked down, shaking, and realized with relief he wasn't hit. The crazy dude's body had taken all the impacts, but he seemed to show no pain whatsoever. John gaped at the bleeding wounds as the man lifted him with one hand and then shoved him into an electrical utility room. He dropped the empty shotgun and started walking towards the officer. The cop dropped his spent magazine. It clattered to the floor. He rapidly, but calmly, inserted another one and in a continuous motion, snapped back the slide. The Terminator still had 20 feet to go. He didn't break his purposeful stride. The cop opened fire. Bullets raked the cyborg's chest, raising miniature red geysers of blood and tissue as they impacted. The Terminator didn't even flinch. 10 feet to go. Blam! 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 Neither the cop nor the Terminator showed the slightest change in expression as the gun ripped the Terminator's jacket to shreds. The pistol emptied again. The Terminator stopped 2 feet in front of the cop. They appraised each other for a second. The cyborg towered over his lean, uniformed opponent. It looked as if the former could snap the latter in two like a matchstick. The Terminator did multi-scans and knew instantly what he was up against. But there was little detailed technical information other than nomenclature mature and basic operational strengths and weaknesses. The programming for this information had been hastily made by a man who had only a memory to go on. The cyborg began racing through tactical possibilities, a dozen a second, and none of them was coming up positive. One thing the cyborg concluded quickly was that it was better to be on the offensive. It lashed out an arm, grabbing the cop in its massive hands, but Austin snapped back with a surprisingly powerful countergrip. John peered around the door and gawked at the two combatants as they slammed each other into the walls on both sides of the corridor. The thin plaster was smashed in. The smaller man lifted the Terminator into the air as if he were a toy and flung him through the wall, then leaped in after.